to segment 1.3. This builds upon what it is that we started to discuss in the last segment, namely relating to the history behind IP. We stopped with discussing the territorial type rights or progress that was occurring in Greece through Italy. We will now build upon that. First off, let's talk about some of the legal frameworks that actually began to emerge during this time frame. So there was some government obvious involvement both in Greece and in Italy, namely that some rights were given to the inventor for the improvement that they created. But there was a much more formalized type process that began to occur during this time. Spend a minute talking about the Venetian Statute. This was in 1474. Venice at the time was quite the hub of innovation. Now, for those of you that have not been to Venice, Venice is obviously an island, and around Venice are multiple other little islands. And each of these little islands have a very specific specialty. So, for example, here is one book from Venice, and it's complete leather on the exterior and cover. But what I want you to pay attention to is take a look at the paper. If you see the paper there, there's a specific design. If you open it up, you can see, for example, that there is a beautiful paper inside. And this is not just printed this way. They have a very specific process of actually taking the paper, dipping it into specific vats in a predetermined manner to actually create the design that you're doing. And so this is called Venetian paper, in fact. And it's a very known type of paper that originates from one of these islands in Venice. But each of these islands have a specific framework, a specific specialty, a specific expertise. And the idea was that you would have one aspect that had some expertise relating to paper making, to glass making. There's even one relating to lace making, shipbuilding. There's one island that actually didn't have any expertise. So what did they do? They said, well, we need to make a name for ourselves. So they painted each of the houses a different color. So they have an expertise in, I guess, modern art design on an island. But this, again, was many, many hundreds of years ago that this occurred. So each of these different islands had this specific expertise. And the concern came out, how are we going to effectively protect our secret trade? So if you were a paper maker, the question is, how do we actually effectively, if we train somebody and go through the effort, we know at the end of the day, potentially that person may leave what it is that they are doing here, and they may take the fruits of everything that we have taught them, and they may go elsewhere, and they may start their own paper business, making business in another city. So the idea was, how do we create a framework to actually protect the information that is being taught? And I would say not just the information that's being taught, but additionally, the new techniques that are being contrived, the new progress for each of these different types of areas that they were actually inventing on. So the Venetian guilds were actually established during this time to protect the secrets of each of these different types of making industries. Again, these guilds were focused primarily on trade secrets, namely securing and ensuring that secrets remain secrets within each of these organizations. The Venetian Statute helped to establish that in a much more formal manner. Fast forward about 200 years in England now, we have the state of monopolies, where as the videos indicated, you have the Statute of Anne that focused on the need for copyrights. Now, what's interesting is that the idea behind copyrights is that if you create some material, some written material, that you want to protect it so that somebody else doesn't necessarily just get a hold of it and copy it. And that was, in fact, what was indicated in the video as well, where you saw one manuscript and then it was kind of scribbled out. And that was the idea behind it, is that if you have something that you in fact have written, how do you ensure that somebody else doesn't just take it and modify it in some manner? France in the 1700s looked at the right of inventors, so that deals with patents. Trademarks emerged about 60 years later within France. USA actually was a little bit late to the game, but that being said, they, for the most part, didn't exist during a lot of this period. But they enacted patent law in 1790. I got that mixed up with trademark. Trademarks came in 1870. But also keep in mind that you will hear even on Capitol Hill to this day arguments relating to the constitutional nature governs the constitutional fabric that was established by the founding fathers relating to intellectual property, namely to promote the progress of science and useful arts by securing limited times to authors and inventors the exclusive right to their respective writings and discoveries. So the Constitution, at a very fundamental level, looked at how do we, there is a need to actually protect and encourage innovation. Now, when the Constitution and the country was established, the details relating to authors and inventors, namely patents and copyrights during that time frame, was not yet established. And that's one of the reasons why it took some time before, for example, patent law was formally established in 1790 that actually clarified that. Trademark law followed again about 80 years later. So we have some legal framework now in place. As we then go into how it is that IP rights then expand from one state or from one country to another, the reality is that there's a lot of borrowing from one group to another. Even in today's modern world, if a country is trying to develop its IP, what do they most frequently do? They piggyback on what already has been done. And that one saves them their own time. And two, it helps them to avoid the mistakes that the other country already made to actually get to the current point that they are at. So, for example, you have cross-pollination and borrowing. Australia's statutes were faithful copies of the English model. Now, you would also expect that, given the fact that Australia at one point was an English territory. We see that during this expansion period, the IP rights, again, do not extend beyond one's territory. So all the progress that occurred into Italy, yes, it did influence other parts of Europe, but as far as the actual rights that are being governed, that ends at the Italian border. And at a high level, this also makes sense that you do not want to be able to, for example, have IP rights that flow from one country to another country. Because, for example, let's assume that Italy would have rights that extend into another sovereign state. And the question would then arise, well, who actually governs the ramifications for any default that occurs within another territory's jurisdiction? Does Italy now have rights to go into another country to administer their law on another soil? So it becomes a clash of states if those IP rights do not end at the territory. We have an international cooperation, but the bilateral agreements were actually slow in making. The UK authors were not receiving royalties from other countries. Charles Dickens, often during this time frame, was known to indicate his displeasure. Victor Hugo even talked about some of his displeasure of his rights being copied in a manner that was not legal or lawful, and he wanted greater rights there. He helped to move that along. So the bilateral agreements, the main two that we will discuss and look at are the Paris Convention of 1883 and the Berne Convention of 1886. So first off, with respect to the Paris Convention, this resulted from the U.S. and obviously in involvement with other countries as well. There is disgruntlement over the World Fair during that time frame, and it was planned to actually be held in Vienna, I think in 1873. And the idea was that if all these countries are going to go to the World Fair and broadcast and show and essentially bring all their bragging rights, how are we going to ensure that it just doesn't become the seatbed for mass mass taking of one's ideas from one country to another. And so the idea behind this was, in short, if you scratch my back, I will scratch your back. And the idea was that they would provide a way to protect what they termed the industrial property. So this looked at largely at the patent rights of protecting inventions, especially as they go abroad. It paved the way for a unified convention during that time frame. But what's interesting is that the Paris Convention, just this framework of having some agreements in place, again, IP rights are territorial and at the territory. That being said, now IP rights are actually being used to leverage one country's position against another country's position. And that actually is a very key point. We'll discuss this later on with respect to evaluating how it is that startups and medium-sized companies and large-sized companies actually use their IP. And usually it comes down to one fundamental concept: your leveraging position. And that's the idea behind IP, is that you can use your position to either negotiate a better deal, to have better protection with respect to your competitors. It's all about improving your leverage position. And it was the same during this time frame as well. The Paris Convention essentially gave the game rules by which the countries were going to play in leveraging their IP one against the other. In short, it became not just necessarily how it is they were going to be asserting the rights, but rather it was an agreement of how they would respect each other's rights. Namely, for example, if we go on your soil and we show some of our best inventions, the idea is that you will abide by our protection or the rights that in fact have been given by our state. Now, we can go into a lot more detail here. The main thing and takeaway that I wanted to come away with is that there was a country by country type agreement, a bilateral agreement that was the basis for this Paris Convention of 1883. The Berne Convention of 1886, that was again about 3 years later, and this actually resulted largely from Victor Hugo. So again, Charles Dickens and others, but they wanted to protect their works as their works were going forth across boundaries. And so the International Literary Association in 1878 paved the way for an eventual meeting in 1883. And they created this draft of a multilateral protection. So just it's the same mentality that we just discussed with respect to patents and industrial property, namely, I scratch your back if you scratch my back. But in short, how is it that we will ensure that, for example, during this time frame, that America is not just taking Charles Dickens' works and selling them under another name, or that Victor Hugo's works are not just being sold by another name, largely in America as well. So the idea was that the Berne Convention would protect artistic and literary works. That was again meant primarily to at the spurring and suggestion by Victor Hugo. He wanted his works protected. But in short, copyrights became the basis for this Berne Convention. Patents became the basis for Paris Convention. And so at the junction of 1883, 1886, we have some, you can almost think of it, international agreements in place whereby countries understand how it is that they will play with each other. Beyond that point, we have some globalization that kind of brings us up to the modern day. So the WIPO organization, World IP Organization, it has its roots in the BIRPI, Bureau for the Protection of Intellectual Property, based in Switzerland, I believe. And WIPO is actually a combination of the Paris and Berne conventions. So again, this idea behind copyrights and patents, that there would be some bilateral type agreements between countries, was again more formally adopted by the WIPO organization. Now, taking a step back, going back to this idea of how do you leverage IP in one's position, the idea is also how do you actually assert compliance? So if, let's assume that, for example, Victor Hugo were to come out with another book, and in the early days of America, that book made it to America and started to be pirated. So it was being sold by another name. It was being reprinted without permission, et cetera, et cetera. The question is, let's assume for purposes of our discussion, the USA and France are now members of the Paris Convention and the Berne Convention, specifically with respect to my example, the Berne Convention, copyrights related. And the question is, how do you actually assert compliance? And the answer is, there is no justice board that will actually administer if somebody is in default. So if USA actually is in default and actually is pirating, there is not an international justice board that you can go to actually ensure that there is compliance on the part of one country to another. So IP now becomes the means by which it is being governed and backed up by other trade agreements. So in other words, for example, if USA was providing paper products to France, or actually the other way around, and because the USA, let's say, was not in compliance right now. If France were providing paper to the USA, France could say, we are going to withhold the shipping and the exchange of paper until you actually say you will abide by the rules of the game. And so trade agreements actually became intertwined with this concept of IP, namely, how do you back up if somebody says, we're not going to abide by your IP rules and we're not going to be a member of the convention? Well, the question is, well, who's going to be the policeman to actually ensure compliance from one country to another? How do you do it? Trade agreements is often how it is. And even in modern discussions as far as agreements and or lateral agreements between countries, even in the last few years, even in the last 10 years, I can think of a few, IP again is being used as a means to be backed up by trade agreements. TRIPS agreement is actually introduced IP law into the international trading system again. So now the trade laws and IP are being even more intertwined, included enforcement procedures, remedies, dispute resolution procedures. So now we actually have a little bit of a mediation or remediation type outlet for IP. Further considerations. Now, what is the purpose of IP? Why do we want IP law? As we discussed, it's a benefit that one confers upon society. And so from that point of view, obviously we want to protect the person that is conferring. That could be a piece of work, that could be an invention. And we also want to give some incentive to the person that has actually given up something. And so that's the idea behind granting some limited monopoly type right, or in the case of a artistic or literary work, you'd be able to control how it is that artistic or literary work is actually disseminated. And if we take one step back from that, at a fundamental level, the whole idea behind IP is that it is advancing society in some manner. So if you take patents, for example, any new or useful type improvement, well, that really is what patents is. The idea is that patents will provide a means by which new ideas actually surface, that inventors will have confidence in actually discussing their new ideas of the progression. Why? Because they know that they will be backed up, that they will have rights to it, that they will be able to assert rights to it, that potentially, even if they incur great costs to actually make it happen, that they know that they will have a financial reward at the end of the day of having some limited monopoly for a time. Now, the question here asks, are any requirements attached to the granting of IP rights? So let's assume that you come up with a new way of printing, just similar to what it is that they did in Venice back in the day. The question is, must you actually use the right? And with respect to patents, the answer is no. You, in fact, can come up with an improvement, but society will not force you to actually use it. Now, in the case of, let's say, a trademark or a name that by which you are disseminating your information, if you no longer use the name, then there is no benefit to society and there's no benefit to you. So if there is a use type requirement in the case for certain forms of IP, but with respect to patents, there is no requirement to actually, in fact, even use it. Can you exclude others from the creation? Again, with respect to patents in particular, the answer is yes. Now, this raises the fundamental patent troll type issue, namely,
If you have rights and you don't use them and you exclude others, what benefit is actually given to society? And the benefit is actually at the end of 20 years, all rights relating to that invention become societal rights. So the inventor cannot have any rights that actually go beyond that 20-year mark. So with that in mind, we'll go ahead and discuss further as far as how it is that IP spurs innovation. To give a quick recap of the history of IP, we looked at how it is that it formed at a territorial type level, it expanded with some legal type framework of having statutory protection. It then went beyond that to have expansion from one country to another. Bilateral agreements allow the countries to talk to each other. Globalization provided a framework by which to actually back up IP so that companies are actually held in compliance with what it is that they say that they will do.